It is so difficult to be patient. I've tried to be patient during different hardship, but I just can't. Can you advise me on how I can be patient?
Imagine that someone owns a car worth $5,000, and let's pretend that the laws in his country state that if a person loses his car due to fire, he is compensated with $1 million. Then suppose that this person took his wife and kids for lunch one day, and while they were having their lunch and the car was parked, an arsonist set it alight. What do you think their reaction would be when they discovered the state of their car? The car was worth $5,000, but the compensation is $1 million. Without doubt, they will say, "Thank God," and will be extremely happy. Why is that so, despite the fact that losing their car is a great loss? The answer is that their knowledge of the great compensation that awaits them has served to decrease the magnitude of the disaster. In fact, they are actually happy because of the great compensation anticipated. So if a person knew how great and wonderful the reward was for patience and endurance in the face of calamity, he would be capable of exercising extreme patience. We know that one good deed receives the compensation of the worth of 10 good deeds, or even multiples of that, up to 700 times, and God gives more to whoever He chooses. In addition, one good deed performed in Mecca is equivalent to 100,000 good deeds. Can you imagine any better example of multiplication of good deeds? Even more than 100,000 times? That is the reward for patience. The Quran says, "And those who persevere patiently will be given their reward in full without measure." One explanation for that verse is that it means that such people will never be called to judgment. They are not judged on doomsday. Instead, they go straight to heaven. Another explanation is that their reward is infinite, not tenfold or 700 or 100,000 times, but infinite. God is infinitely generous. God also says in the Quran, "And we shall certainly reward those who remain steadfast according to the best of their actions." This means that each of our deeds will be upgraded to the highest level that we ever achieved in relation to the particular deed. What does that mean? Well, for example, the first thing we are asked about on the Day of Judgment is our prayers. If the person being judged happened to be one of those who showed patience and endurance, his deeds will be judged according to the best example of each deed that he performed. Let's say that this person prayed throughout his life about 25,678 times. Well, which prayer of those was the absolute best prayer he ever performed? Let's say that it happens to be the Maghrib prayer he performed on the 17th of Ramadan in a given year. Because that particular time he had performed his ablutions thoroughly, went to the mosque early, waited for the call to prayer, and stood in the very first row behind the Imam. He prayed with reverence and reflected upon the meaning of the verses that were being recited. He was so moved that he cried in reverence for God. He did not annoy anyone near him with the ringing of his mobile phone or with his sweaty odor. On the contrary, he was a source of comfort and peace to all who saw him at the mosque because of his cleanliness, his pleasant smile, and calm demeanor. So God accepted his prayer. It was in fact the best of the 25,678 prayers he had performed throughout his life. He also happened to be among those who exhibited patience and endurance. So as we said, God will reward him for his deeds in accordance with the best example of such deeds. So the result is that when his prayers are being evaluated, each of the remaining 25,677 prayers he had performed throughout his life will be upgraded and rewarded just like the most perfect prayer he had ever performed. Next, we come to the fasting days. How many days did he fast? He fasted a total of 935 days. Which day was the most perfect day of fasting? It happened to be a certain day for many reasons. So all the remaining 934 days of fasting will be upgraded to that level, and he will be rewarded accordingly. and so on and so on. So when we say that God is generous, don't try to compare that to the generosity of your mother or your father or anyone else for that matter. Think of open treasure troves that are never depleted. Think of he who gives without fear of poverty. Think of he who is never afraid that he will have a lack of anything, however much he gives. Next, we come to the different kinds of patience. Scholars have said that there are 4 kinds of patience. The first type is patience and resignation in the face of adversity. The second is self-restraint in the face of sin. The third is perseverance in obeying God. And the fourth is perseverance and rectitude in association with blessings. To reiterate, the 4 types of patience are endurance in coping with adversity, restraint in the face of sin, perseverance in obedience to God, and patience and modesty as a reaction to blessings. Regarding patience and endurance in the face of adversity, we have already spoken about that, and we said that knowing the great reward that awaits us and having true hope in God's rewards will help us to endure hardship or disaster, because we know what God has in store for us and how great the reward will be. Next, we come to restraint and fortitude in the face of sin. This is especially relevant at a time when sinning has become easier than ever and so commonplace that some sins seem to be quite ordinary and acceptable. Examples nowadays include smoking and viewing pornography. People are now used to these things and view them as perfectly normal. The most important thing is to strengthen one's faith and one's relationship with God through the Quran and through constant remembrance of God. Remembrance of God with heartfelt reflection. It is also important in order to avoid getting accustomed and desensitized to such sins so that they come to be regarded as acceptable. We must condemn such things within our hearts at the very least. Even if we don't have the courage to be vocal against such sins and do not have the ability to act against preventing them, we must at least denounce them within our hearts. Then comes perseverance in our obedience to God, which means perseverance in performing the acts of worship that we are commanded to do. It is often difficult to cope with performing such acts of obedience to God. Waking up at 4 in the morning, for example, and washing your face, arms, and feet while everyone else is fast asleep is no easy task. Waking up in the middle of the night to perform qiyam or spending the night in prayer is not an easy task either, but it does not go unrewarded. If people knew the reward that awaited them, they would think very differently. Take, for example, the reward for praying the dawn prayers and the evening prayers. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, says, if people knew the reward for it, they would come to it crawling on their hands and knees. In other words, even if they couldn't walk, they would come crawling to those prayers in order to attain the great reward. We must create a relationship with God so that we can persevere in performing the acts of obedience that we are required to do. The important thing is that they must be done with love and sincerity. There can be some measure of fear of God and some measure of desire in attaining God's rewards. These are supporting factors in the motivation that drives our deeds. But the basis of our relationship with God should be love. God addresses Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the Quran and tells him, say, if you love God, then follow me, God shall love you. Finally, we come to the 4th kind of patience. It is patience and perseverance in association with blessings. In other words, how we cope with the blessings bestowed on us. For many people, this is the most difficult kind of patience. Blessings tend to make a person conceited, smug, and self-assured. He comes to believe that he owes this blessing and that he was responsible for bringing it upon himself. So he begins to use this blessing carelessly and to misuse it. In other words, he starts feeling that this blessing is a personal accomplishment that he was capable of attaining, and he forgets that it was God who blessed him with it. So instead of thanking God for that blessing, and instead of using it to do what pleases God, he starts using it for things that displease God. He starts using it in ways that are different from what God intended. You see, a poor person, for example, has no option except to be patient in the face of hunger. But what about a rich person? It is difficult for such a person to resist the temptation of overspending and overindulging. That is because spending money is associated with pleasure and with a thrill. A beautiful woman may come to believe that her beauty belongs to her and not to God. He gave her that beauty in order to test her and see how she would use it and how she would manage it. Will she display her beauty in accordance with his commands or not? A strong person is similarly tested. Is he going to use his strength in helping the weak and defending the oppressed? Or is he going to use it to overpower, intimidate, or oppress others? Prophet Joseph was subjected to many trials and tribulations. His brothers conspired against him and wanted to kill him. They threw him into a well, and he was soon after sold as a slave. Despite him being born a free person, the wife of the chancellor tried to seduce him, and he was unjustly imprisoned for many years as a result of that. And then, many years later, he became the ruler of Egypt, a superpower, the greatest and most powerful country at that time. Scholars say that this empowerment was in fact the most difficult test he had to face, because perseverance and rectitude in the face of blessings actually constitute the most difficult kind of patience. I would like to sum up by saying that patience is not unattainable, but at the same time, it is not easy, which is the reason that the reward for it is so great. Patience is a great challenge. If you are determined, you will come out victorious in the face of such a challenge. But if you are not determined, you will be conquered. This worldly life of ours consists of a series of confrontations. The truth confronts falsehood and injustice, and good confronts evil. You must be a fighter if you wish to triumph in the face of this great challenge, and may God help us all to be patient.